morning. It is morning here, so morning. Actually, it's afternoon here. I lose my tracks of time. I hope everybody is having a wonderful day. And I hope everybody is taking care of themselves, giving themselves grace and love, understanding that, they're worthy and healthy and beautiful just the way that they are. And I hope everybody's having a wonderful weekend. Wherever you are, though, in some places it might actually not be the weekend anymore. We're going to do some more on European ancestry today. We'll kind of start a little bit with the Gravatians, but then we'll probably take it down to a little bit closer to our timeline. I'm just trying to make sure that I share the live out and then it gets out to everybody. I'm physically not doing my ultimate best today, so we'll see how long I can function today before I kind of just can't function anymore, because that happens. And hopefully I'll be able to function for long enough to be in here for a little while. It's been, I don't know, I don't think I'm like getting sick. I think it's just my body, because my, being, having physical problems just run out of, space and energy sometimes. And I've been doing a lot lately. And so I don't think I'm sick per se, just disabled per se, right? And so if I can't stay in for a long period of time, I do apologize. And, I'll definitely try and be back in over the week. My bio father is in town this week, though, so it might be a little bit more sporadic than normal, just because of the fact that I'll be trying to do some stuff and make sure that they're taken care of, and to spend some time with them. But I did want to go have so much fun with the family. I really, really enjoy the fact. And the little puppy, Sleepy got a new puppy, and Sleepy's new puppy is a walking bull. And I'm like, oh, so cute. My partner is constantly on this idea that we're going to get an English bulldog. And I'm like, yeah, like 5 years after my dog dies. Like, we are not doing another dog until we've had a hot minute where I'm not taking care of animals. But your dog is adorable, and I am totally down. Not with getting another dog right now, but with a dog like that when it's time to get another dog, right? But I do want to go ahead and, we've spent a long time working on paleoanthropology and taking a look at what paleoanthropology is. A little Scorpio, I didn't know Bear was a Scorpio. And taking a look at what paleoanthropology states. And of course, we'll always get back to the paleoanthropology aspect of it. I do want to touch on some of the things and work towards some of the things that I wanted to be able to work towards anyways, right? And some of the reasons that I came in here. And so I'm definitely wanting to make sure and touch on some of those things. And so we're going to work on some European ancestry for a little while. Again, one of the several reasons that I came in, or the main reason that I came in, was because using TikTok and a video platform gets information out quicker to more people anymore than books do. I can write all the books in the world, but if people don't have a reason to see them, understand them, buy them, nobody's doing it, right? So I, came in here because I feel like if I can catch people with a soundbite, with just a little bit of information, that I can catch people deeper, right? And so that's definitely one of the reasons, or the main overreaching reason. There are several underlying reasons, though, and one of the underlying reasons is to help people who have European descent decolonize and to find their own ancestry and, try and make those connections without appropriating other people's culture, right? I know that there are a lot of accomplices and allies out there who are working very hard on decolonizing and to find culture and history without appropriating other people's culture and history. And so I want to make sure that people have access to that stuff, right? I am so weirded out on what is actually like in that comment that is supposed to be hidden Sleepy, because it says like his mama, and I don't see anything about that is supposed to That's weird. Yeah, I'm not sure what about that comment was weirded out, right? Um, so I want to make sure that people have an understanding of their own ancestry, right? And their own spaces and what they need to do to find those connections, right? I can't give you all those connections because that's just, I don't think that we do a lot of things when things are handed to us, anyways. A and B, giving somebody, I can't tell who you are or your connections or what sings to you, things like that, right? So I can't give you connections, but I can give you information on how to find connections and how to make connections, right? And so that's one of the big reasons that I come in. And so I want to make sure that we're doing that right. I know that we've spent a lot of time in paleoanthropology, and because we need to, we've spent a lot of time in, some of the stuff that Indigenous people in the United States and Canada and Mexico are dealing with, right? But we also need to focus on some of the reasons that I came in, right? Which is the fact that there are a lot of allies and accomplices out there who are trying to reconnect to their own Indigenous ancestry without appropriating culture and ancestry from other people. And so, with that, I do definitely want to speak on a lot of the European ancestry and culture that we have so that people who are of purely European descent or even European mixed with something else and want to connect to their European sides can figure out how to find that information to have a little bit of information. Um, TikTok gives pretty much anybody who has 1,000 followers a live space. And when they give somebody a live space, people are able to have that live space. We set our own boundaries and our own rules. This is our space. In my space, the boundaries and the rules that I set are, I come in here to teach this information because I don't believe that information should be gate kept behind a $40,000 a year paywall or intensive language that's hard for even people with several degrees to understand. Um, and I'm doing this because of my terrified of most humans, but I still love most humans, right? I can be terrified and still love, right? Um, and so I want people to, I want people to understand how worthy they are and how good they are, right? How beautiful they are, right? And so I'm coming in as an act of love. And so ask that I don't expect you to love me and I don't expect you to even like what I'm saying, but I do expect you to treat me with the same respect and kindness that I am treating you, right? And so if you are in my lives, that's one of the things that I ask as a boundary is that you treat me with the same respect and kindness that I'm treating you. I ask that if you think that I'm incorrect about something, that you tell me what it is and why. Like, don't just tell me I'm a liar. Don't just tell me I'm wrong. I've got sources that back up pretty much everything I talk about. And so if you think that I'm incorrect, then I would appreciate it if you tell me why so that I can take that information and learn something new and I can do something new, right? I'm not an expert in any field. I don't want to be an expert in any field. I have areas of focus and areas of study like most of us should. And I'm constantly trying to learn new things because I think that we should always be learning new things. I feel that when we're not actually learning new things and adjusting our understanding is when we start slowly dying, right? And the other things that I ask within my live space is you keep your racism elsewhere. If you need to be a racist asshat, then you can scroll on and find another place to be there. We'll probably talk at some point about why the theory of race has been debunked, but race does not exist. Racism still exists, right? And culture and ethnicity still exist, but the idea that your skin tone dictates your phenotype dictates your genotype, that your skin tone states whether or not you're intelligent or whether or not you're able to feel pain or whether or not you're good at something or bad at something, all of those things are debunked. That's not true. And so anybody who is dealing with that thought process or still within that thought process and can't get out of that colonial construct and doesn't want to just listen to try and get out of that colonial construct, I'm going to ask you to take it somewhere else. The same thing based on, or the same concept, I would like you to treat the same concept with gender, desire, and religion. First of all, I don't want to talk about your God. I think that the God of all three major world religions is a narcissist. I don't like him. But bringing in your anti Semitism, your Islamophobia, your pro Christian thought process, any of those things in my chat are not things that I find acceptable in this chat. We don't do hate in my chat. And the other thing that I ask is that when you have phobias based on gender desire, that you realize that gender is a construct that society creates. And so how I view myself in my head is based on the construct that society has created. Okay. And I get to choose that. And biologically, we have three sexes, male, female, and intersex, biologically. And the idea that you should be phobic or hate or fear or whatever, because it's not really fear, let's be real, that you should spread hate on people based on their desires or their gender, is really faulty. It's really lacking compassion and empathy, and is really problematic. So I just want you to take it somewhere else. You can either sit and listen and maybe get some education on why these things aren't healthy, and why, you're a worthy human being just by being a worthy human being, just by being here, right? Or you can take it elsewhere. It's up to you. Just don't bring it to me, right? And so, with those said, let me go ahead and start talking about what we're talking about today. Today, again, we're going to touch on European ancestry, and we're going to touch on European ancestry starting at 40,000 years ago. We'll probably take it a little bit forward from that. We'll probably take it a little bit forward from the Gravachians just to give some thought process. The Natufeans and the Magdalenians are actually two beautiful different cultures. The Natufeans actually are starting in the Middle East and then move into Eurasia, right? When we're looking at these different things, there's a couple of things that I want you to understand. So I want to go over a couple of vocabulary terms early on, and then we'll probably touch on them again. So if you hear me repeat stuff, it's just because people come and go, right? I'm going to touch on first migration, immigration, and colonization. These are really important words that most people don't really have the full concept and understanding of what they mean. I blame the school system, right? So migration is when you're moving into an area that does not have people within it, or you are living in a gathering culture, and that gathering culture is the hunter-gatherer side of the gathering culture, and you migrate on a yearly schedule. You go one place in the summer, one place in the winter, one place in the spring, one place in the fall. That is a migration pattern of human. And this is about going to where food is, right? There are two different kinds of collecting cultures. One is the hunter-gatherer collecting culture, and one is the collector culture. The collectors stay in one space, and then they go out and gather and bring back, often camping for 6 to 8 weeks out here to gather all the resources here, and then coming back to their central location. Whereas hunter-gatherers are cycling through and moving on a migration pattern, seasonal migration pattern. Migration is moving into a space that has nobody else there, or moving in a seasonal migration pattern. Immigration is moving into a space that has people already within that space, but not replacing their culture within your own. Instead, you move into a space that has people and a culture and a civilization or government or just people, and you become a part of the culture that is already there. You immigrate and meld into, you join the culture. You're not trying to, you might bring ideas with you that might actually be adopted by the culture, right? Yet you're not trying to replace your ideas with that culture's ideas, and that is immigration. We see this really, like within the US, we see people immigrating from all over the country, and they're not trying to replace our government with their government. They're not trying to replace our thought processes with their thought process. They move into the US, they get jobs within the US structure system, they send their children to US schools, they might work in the US government, and they're not trying to replace that with their own thought processes and ideas. That is immigration. Colonization is moving into a space that already has people and replacing their government and their culture with your own. This is almost always done by force. I cannot think of a single example of this that is not done by force. Colonization is moving into a space that already has people and a government and a structure, and replacing that people and government and structure with your own. Okay. And again, it is done by violence, usually by attempted genocide, and having people like kind of forced out of a space. When we're looking at these three different terms really are really important. Sorry, I can see this reflecting my glasses. And when I see it reflecting my glasses, it drives me insane. ND, right? ND. So when we're looking at this movement into space idea, yeah, immigrants here in the United States are moving in, and they are becoming a part of culture. They're contributing. They're sending their kids to schools. They're doing the positive things that immigration is. Immigration is a positive thing, right? Colonization is not a positive thing. Migration is a positive thing. Immigration is a positive thing. These are things that we do. It introduces new genetics. It ensures the continuity of our species, right? To be able to do these things. And because The biome created all of us to tend the biome when we are immigrating into a new space, as long as we're not replacing the knowledge there, right, with our own thought process, which would be really problematic for that biome. We're actually helping the biome, right? The biome needs humanity to tend the biome, right? And not the way that we're tending the biome now, because we're not really tending the biome. We're kind of greedy. But humanity was created by the biome to tend the biome. And so having more people tend the biome is a positive thing. Having more genetics is a positive thing. Replacing your ideas of how the biome needs to be tended with, taking away the indigenous ideas of how a biome needs to be tended and replacing them with a, tending of a biome from another space is not positive. And the reason is because biomes are not all the same, right? Spaces are not all the same. Western-based agriculture, monocrop agriculture worked really well along the Nile River, where it was created at 15 to 18,000 years ago, because the Nile River's yearly flood replaces the fertile soil. And so you don't need to have all the different plants and animals in a space to create the fertility of a space for the plants that are growing in that space. Because again, that yearly flood replaces the nutrients in the soil. But if you take that thought process and you move it anywhere else that doesn't have that yearly flood and doesn't have that yearly replacement of nutrients, and you rip out the entire biome that's there and you replace it with monocrop agriculture, that monocrop agriculture doesn't have the ability to pull nutrients from the biome because you removed the biome that they need for nutrients, right? So I've done a lot of study on Sweden. If you think Sweden had zero crime, you're kind of false. And the immigrants in Sweden are not causing problems. And like I know a lot of people from Sweden. Sweden's one of the areas of study. Sweden's an ancestral region for me. Sweden is a focus for me when it comes to books that I'm writing, right? Sweden's a major focus for me. I would state that you're not seeing in Sweden where the immigrants are actually causing those problems. Now, that does not mean that there are not pockets, like there are pockets everywhere of people that are causing problems, but as a mass whole in Sweden, it is not the immigrants that are causing the problem, right? When violence rises in an area, is it because of the people that have moved in that area are causing the violence, or is it because the people moved in that area and somebody else is angry that they're in that area and they're causing the violence? When we look at the United States, we talk about terrorism here within the United States. This terrorist cell, these immigrants, right? Immigrants are causing a rise of violence. Immigrants are causing these problems. Immigrants, immigrants, immigrants. But the problem is with that is the fact that it's actually usually white men who are causing these problems, who are like been here since 1492. Their families have, right? Like, so we're not seeing that the immigrants are usually the ones that are causing the violence here in the US. We're seeing that it is a violent reaction to having immigrants within the US. And I would state that for the most part, from anybody that I know from Sweden, that's what they say, that it is not the immigrants causing the violence, it is the anti-immigrant sect of society that is violent towards the immigrants causing the violence. So when we're looking at that, we need to actually look at the facts of the matter and not the propaganda that people are telling you, right? Because what you're doing, yeah, melting pots are good. Melting pots are good as long as you're not colonized. As long as you're not colonizing the space, melting pot is positive, because melting pot introduces more genetic. So we all know that you shouldn't inbreed. You shouldn't have sex with your sister and have a baby. We all know that. Everybody knows you should not have sex with your sister and have a baby. Everybody knows that. That's because the more you have sex with your relations and have babies, the more genetic mutations happen, because there is a lack of genetic diversity. So having more people in a space increases genetic diversity. Having more genetics, yeah, except for Alabama. There are regions in the United States who do not know that, I'll agree. But having more people of more genetic diversity within a space increases the genetic diversity. It actually creates better physicality for most humans, right? Because that genetic narrowing and that genetic bottlenecking and that inbreeding is not happening, right? No, that's interbreeding. Interbreeding is between two cultures. Inbreeding is between two people of the same family line. And that's another good definition. Intra-breeding or intra-mixing is two different cultures who are exchanging genes, okay? inbreeding or inmixing is one family line, right? So the Habsburgs were extremely inbred, and the Habsburgs were so inbred that they had this really, they got insane. Like there was an insanity problem within the Habsburgs, and they had like this really mouth problem. Like you would have this huge jaw, okay, and a lot of times would have serious overbite like this or underbite like this, and they couldn't eat by the end of the Habsburg reign. They actually started to have to marry outside of their family because they were becoming so inbred, right? There was insanity within the Pharaohic dynasties within Egypt in the later dynasties because of the inbreeding. So, like, if you look at Cleopatra the Seventh's dynasty, Cleopatra the Seventh's family line was really insane in many instances. Her father was considered insane. He was called the flute player because he was pretty insane, and it's because their dynasty, they intermarried. They married their mothers or their sons and daughters and siblings. That was how they kept their line pure, right? And in keeping that line pure, that was very problematic. That caused inbreeding. So inbreeding is within a family line, and interbreeding is between two different cultures. Okay, or species. We interbred with the Neanderthals. We interbred with the. I really don't want anti-Semitism in my chat. So if that was meant as an anti-Semitic remark, I would like you to remove it or not say it again. We don't deal with racism, and that includes anti-Semitism and Islamophobia. We don't deal as well with racism that is based on religious thought process, because that's what that is, right? So I would appreciate it if you kept that somewhere else. Okay, and if that's what it was, and like I said, I might not be. I just wanted to make sure because the way that the scroll is going, sometimes it's hard for me to see, right? So when we did interbreed with the Neanderthals, and that's why we have Neanderthal DNA. That's what, again, interbreeding is between two cultures, right? So the breeding that we did with the Neanderthals is considered intrabreeding, right? Because we are breeding with a different culture, a different species, right? So you might be correct. Let me look at that. Inter is referring to something between two or more spaces or groups. Intra is used to indicate something happening within the same group. So intra would be a nation who only gets genetics or mixes with people within their nation, where inter would be two separate nations. So intra would be currently Homo sapiens are only breeding Homo sapiens because there's no other species. Inter would be breeding between sapien and Neanderthal. Just had to double my check on what it is, right? I do Google it a lot of the times. You'll see me pull up stuff just because I want to make sure that my definitions or something is correct. And like I said, I don't know everything. I'm not trying to know everything. I think that trying to know everything is a fallacy. I don't think that anybody can know everything, and the thought process that we can is actually pretty problematic. I'll try to know the whole friggin' world, but I also know that that's not something that I can actually get right. So when we are looking at how people are moving through space, the early peoples that are moving into Asia and Europe are peoples moving into this space that are immigrating or migrating. Now, why do I say immigrating? Because Neanderthals are in some of these spaces. Now, we have lived at this point with Neanderthals for roughly 100,000 years in the Levant area. We had two caves side by side with the Neanderthals that were like a 5-minute walk, where we exchanged a lot of genetics and where we exchanged a lot of information, where our tool usage changed and everything else, right? And so as we're moving into Europe, we are taking the knowledge that we've gotten from the Neanderthals and sometimes the Neanderthals with us. As we're living at this time in the Levant, we are constantly moving, and I want to make sure that that is understood. This is why we see that most of Africa actually has Neanderthal DNA prior to colonization, just like all of the rest of the world has Neanderthal DNA prior to colonization. In fact, there's only two places in the world that don't have Neanderthal DNA prior to colonization. That's the Yoruba population of West Africa and the Kwe population of South Africa. Those two populations have three ghost species in them. Ghost species are species that we see a couple of their genetics in our DNA, like we see a couple Neanderthal genetics and a couple Denisovan genetics with their DNA, but we haven't found the actual species yet, so we don't have a full genome of them, so we don't know who they are, what they look like, what they did, so we call them ghost species. So those two spaces within Africa that do not have Neanderthal DNA, and again, there are only two communities, only two groups of people within Africa that do not have Neanderthal DNA, are the Kwe and the Yoruba, and they have three ghost species. The rest of the planet has Neanderthal DNA. Some places have more, some places have less. You see that Africa and Europe have 1 to 2% Neanderthal DNA. Asia has about 4 to 5% Neanderthal DNA. You'll see about 3% Neanderthal DNA in indigenous Australians. And in Turtle Island and Abiyala, Turtle Island being North America and Abiyala being South America, the indigenous people here roughly have 1% Neanderthal DNA usually. They also have Denisovan DNA here, about 0.02 to 0.03% Denisovan DNA. And they also have a ghost species here. And there's also ghost species in indigenous Australians. So when we're seeing that the Europeans, the early Europeans are moving into Eurasia, they're moving into Eurasia with Neanderthals, and they're moving into Eurasia into spaces that are already occupied with Neanderthals, and they're moving into spaces that are not. And the reason that these spaces are not occupied by Neanderthals at this point in time is because of the last glacial maximum, or the second to last glacial maximum. And that drove the Neanderthals down in Europe. We see that the Neanderthals were all over Eurasia, but that glacial maximum, as the ice covers Eurasia, people are moving down. And so the Neanderthals are moving down and moving down and moving down. So when we're seeing people moving into Europe at the end of that glacial maximum, they're moving into spaces that are already occupied with Neanderthals, which would be immigration. And then they're also moving into spaces as the ice clears that are not occupied by Neanderthals. This would be migration. Taking the knowledge that they have, and they're taking the knowledge that they've gotten from the Neanderthals, the advanced knowledge that the two of them together created, because when two different minds meet, we have an explosion of information that creates new things. Taking all of this into Europe with them, they are melding into the cultures that are already there when they need to be. And when they don't need to be, like there's no culture already there, they're migrating into space and creating culture. Now, this starts at 50,000 years ago, roughly. We do have some evidence of people in France at like 54,000 years ago, of Homo sapien in France in like 54,000 years ago. The main movement, though, is after 50,000 years ago. And as this movement into Europe is happening at 54,000 years ago, and they're taking this knowledge with them, the knowledges that they're taking with them are knowledges, some that the Neanderthals already have, like fire, the idea of tailored clothing, which we do see within the Neanderthals, the idea of foodie, like to be into different kinds of foods, to use herbs and spices, Neanderthals actually have ovens, right? So to be able to cook in many of the levels that we're cooking on today. And they're taking in their knowledges of medicine and tool usage, right? These things meld with Neanderthals. These things create more information. These things actually build up more information. Now, by 40,000 years ago, the Neanderthals are pretty much gone. So this is where we start with the Gravachian culture. The Araucanians, who are the people before the Gravachian culture, they are a culture who is mixing with the Neanderthals. The Neanderthals are there. They're a culture where Neanderthal people are a big part of their culture, and that's why I'm starting at 40,000 years ago with the Gravachian culture, because we're looking at cultures post-Neanderthal. Now, again, we're seeing that all of this mixing with the Neanderthals, all of this interchange within the Neanderthals really gives us an advancement in knowledge. We don't start burying our dead until the Neanderthals have started burying their dead. We don't start cave art until the Neanderthals have started cave art. We don't start body decoration until the Neanderthals start body decoration. Okay. So all of these things are things that we get from the Neanderthals. All of these things are things that the Neanderthals show us. our sense of identity, as in I am me and you are you, comes from this interchange with the Neanderthals. It is not until this interchange between us and the Neanderthals that we start to have a sense that I am me and you are you, and that life continues after death. There's a soul that continues after death. This is why we bury our dead. Burial of dead is because of this concept that that was a human being and object permanence of that human being, right? There's something there that goes on. So all of these concepts that we're bringing in with us are concepts that we already knew, right? And again, we actually did so much of our interbreeding within the Levant area, which is why we see Neanderthal DNA everywhere, because people moving back into Africa and moving up into Eurasia at that time. And the concepts and the ideas that we're dealing with within the Gravatian period that are different and new is the start of anamorphism and the start of creating statuary or art that depicts different things that humans are doing. Now, we do see cave art that shows hunters prior to this, right? We do see cave art that shows interaction with animals prior to this. We do not see statuary like the goddesses that we know of all come from the Gravatian period. The anamorphic statue that came across the news probably last year, maybe it was the year before, where it's a lion-headed man with marking on his arms. This is something that comes from the Gravatian period. It's 40,000 years ago. When we see, I'm just going to do a mod check. I think I have a couple in here, but just because I'm not paying attention to chat, I want to go ahead and do a mod check. If you are a mod in here, would you please let me know that you're here so that I can make sure that we have a few mods in here, because we all know just how bad that this chat can get. And if I don't have mods, I'll probably go ahead and turn it off so that we can make sure. Yeah, we're talking about the background. Okay, Duncan, I know you're here. Are you it? Noah is here, and I think Noah became a mod. Maybe it was Noah yesterday, so I think I have at least 2 mods in here. If it gets bad, Duncan, would you go ahead and pin up something so that I can see that it's getting bad? Because I do see the pinned comments, and that way I can make sure that I can turn off the comments if it gets bad. I know we're close to like 200, and sometimes it can get really bad. So the Gravatians at this time, right, at 40,000 years ago, having moved into Europe from the Levant area, right, the Gravatian people bringing all of this information and knowledge, right, is really giving us this start, this foundation of who we are. We see actually that tattooing starts with the Gravatians. We see that at 35,000 years ago, there are tattoo tools in a cave in France, right? And as we see these things, and as we see this sense of cultural identity, this sense of self-identity, this sense of taking care of each other in a different way, and this sense comes with a lot with the medicine that we see that starts in Neanderthals and then translates over to us, and a lot within the different ways that we're identifying each other, right? So one thing that we want to touch on really early on in this understanding of people moving in is what they're looking like, because I've already seen the comments in the chat. So we as a species start from a convergence of several different species in about 3 regions in Africa. We don't become a singular species of our own until about 125,000 to 135,000 years ago. By this point, we're already in the Levant area. We're already intermixing, with Neanderthals. Our start as a species in Africa gives us certain qualities as a species. These qualities as a species is, for the most part, we're tall and lean, especially compared to the Neanderthals and some other species. This is because the taller and leaner you are, the more skin surface you have, the easier it is for heat to dissipate from your body. We start with dark skin. And the reason that we start with dark skin, we all have melanin in our skin, every single one of us. The darker the skin, the higher the concentration of melanin within the skin. The higher the concentration of melanin within the skin gives us the ability to actually protect ourselves from too much vitamin D from the sun and protect ourselves from burning. This doesn't mean people with dark skin doesn't burn. It means that they burn less than people with light skin in high sun content areas. We also develop with dark eyes, And this is because dark eyes, as opposed to light eyes, dark eyes are meant for a high sun content environment. They make it to where it's easier to see in a high sun area. If you have light eyes and you go out in the bright sun, it's hard for you to see. And we see that we develop with tightly coiled hair. And the reason that we develop with tightly coiled hair, this was an anthropological study done by a beautiful Black anthropologist who also does hair work, right? And so she went, well, I want to know. And so she went and did the studying. And what she found was that there's a kind of a cap or a shade that is created, and then there's a lattice work that's created. And the lattice work actually allows airflow across the scalp. And that lattice work that allows airflow across the scalp actually cools the brain. We see that Neanderthals speciating in Europe actually speciate kind of differently than this because of the environment. They speciate with light eyes, they speciate with light skin, and they speciate with huge noses with lots of sinus capacity behind the huge noses, that mid-face prognosis, which allows them to heat the air before it gets to the brain. So Neanderthals developed to heat the air before it gets to the brain, and we developed to cool the air as it's passing across the brain so that we can actually not boil our brains and they don't freeze their brains, right? So as we're moving into Europe, we are all dark of skin. Now, that does not mean that we don't have the alleles for light skin within us already, because we do. The alleles for light skin start at 900,000 years ago, and they start within Homo heidelbergensis and Homo erectus, two of our ancestors. So we absolutely have the alleles for lighter skin in our genes as we move in the area, but we are not expressing those alleles. The alleles that we are expressing overarchingly, I mean, you might occasionally find somebody with slightly lighter skin. That does happen. But overarchingly, the alleles that we are expressing are dark alleles because of the fact that we come from a high sun content area and we're trying to protect ourselves from the environment. Now, you can get vitamin D from everywhere. You can get vitamin D from many different plants. So we do not see that our skin tone changes as fast as our eye color does. We see that our eye color changes first because, again, light eyes are a low light adaptation, and that low light adaptation is necessary in a predatory region, right? We have to make sure that we see the mountain lion way more than we have to make sure that we get vitamin D from the sun, right? So when we see that we're moving into Europe, we are seeing that we are moving into Europe with dark skin, and at that point, dark eyes and tightly coiled hair. So at 40,000 years ago, the Gravachians are a dark-skinned, dark-eyed, tightly coiled hair group of people, right? We see that this movement through and this movement in taking all of these traditions initially with the Neanderthals gives us about 10,000 years mixing with the Neanderthals in that region, even though we've already mixed with the Neanderthals in the Levant area. And we also see, and this is an important thought process and theory, that our intermixing with the Neanderthals, our community with the Neanderthals is community. It's not violence. We don't see violence really in the archaeological record until 10,000 years ago. We don't see any evidence of violence between us and Neanderthals. We see a species that by this time is roughly 10,000 people left in their species. And so their intermixing with us actually gives them better genetics. Again, we get back to the fact that everything knows that interbreeding or inbreeding is bad. Everything knows that inbreeding is bad. And Neanderthals at this point, because they're so narrow genetically and so few of them left, they're very inbred. They're marrying their nieces and their uncles and their aunts and their cousins. And because of this, are having relations because marriage doesn't exist. Because of this, we're seeing that this movement of us into their regions and the mixing of us with them within the Levant is actually introducing genetics for them. And so they're not actually as sick. They're not, actually as genetically narrow. Okay, let me go ahead and do this. Thank you so much, Duncan. Have a great day. So because I can't judge how bad it's going to get, I'm going to go ahead and turn comments off. I will turn comments back on in a little while so that people can ask questions. Unfortunately, my chats can get very hateful and very trolly. And if I don't have people in here making sure that they're taken care of, you might be dealing with stuff that I really don't want you to have to deal with. I can ignore it sometimes, and that's what I'm working on right now. I don't want you to have to deal with any hate speech or any shit like that in my chat. And so I'm going to go ahead and turn the comments off for a while. I do believe that it is important for people to be able to ask questions. I do believe that that's the way we learn the best. So you can go over to my YouTube channel and you can, and I'll actually tell you when I go live. So that's a little bit of a help. And you can ask questions there. I co-stream on YouTube while I'm doing this. And you can also, if you want to, wait until I turn the comments back on. I'll try and turn them back on for people to ask questions every little while, so that people have that chance. And if it gets down pretty low, I have a tendency to turn them back on because I start to figure that it might be safe for a little while, right? So when we're looking at this timeline, what we're looking at is that the Neanderthals are definitely having lost their genetic diversity or intermixing with us willingly. This isn't a violent thing. This isn't a war thing. There's no evidence of that, just none in the archaeological record, right? I know that there are books out there that claim that they have evidence. I've seen the bones that they're talking about, and the bones that they're talking about don't look like what they say they are. In fact, if you look at the bones when they post them on the documentaries, they don't look like what they say they are. So there is no evidence within the archaeological record of us actually fighting with Neanderthals. There is plenty of evidence of us intermixing with Neanderthals, and there's plenty of evidence that we as a species coming from convergence don't actually see the Neanderthals as anything really different. We might see that they look different, but we're used to everybody looking different. Our parents both looked different. Our grandparents looked different. Everybody around us looked different. We're not used to differences being a bad thing at this period of time. With the Gravachians, which again start at 40,000 years ago and go to roughly 30,000 years ago, we see that the Gravachians are a group of people that have pretty much most of the technology that you can think of today that you want, right? They have the ability to create homes. We see wood structures as far back as 500,000 years ago with Homo heidelbergensis, which is one of our ancestors. Have the ability to create structures and homes. Have the ability to tailor their clothing. Now, this doesn't mean you take it down to the tailor and he fits it to you exactly. This means having clothing that's fitted to the body instead of just being slung over and wrapped around and tied. So there's not a lot of holes for air to come in, not a lot of ways for you to be frozen, right? And we see there is different tool usages that we're seeing within the Gravachian than within their predecessors. This is basically just a refining of earlier tools. And we're seeing that there's an extensive amount of tools. Now, within the stone tool assemblages that we see, stone tools are what we see the most of when we're talking about tools for different species and for us prior, because they're what stays in the archaeological record. It should be understood, though, that that isn't the only tools that they're using. They're using wooden spears. They're using wooden tools of every kind. There is usage of basketry. There is usage of different plant and matter to create different things. Like you can fold up a leaf and make a cup. You can use a stomach of an animal to make a bag to drop hot rocks and to boil stuff. So there are extensive tool usages being done that aren't necessarily the tool usages of stone that we're seeing, right? It's because of how things degrade in the archaeological record, how things just degrade naturally, biodegradable, right? So we're also seeing that there is a sense of identity that is expressed within their clothing and within the things that they wear. Now, the headdress on the person behind me is a Gravachian headdress because we see this headdress on our goddesses that we have from the Gravachian period. We have the Venus of Willendorf and the Venus of Brassenfie, and both of them have a similar headdress on. There's debate as to whether or not this is actually a headdress, like a cap put on, or shells are braided into their hair. That is a debate. If you look at the two, you can kind of form your own opinion one way or the other. I kind of think that Brassenfie is more braids and Willendorf is more beaded headdress. Willendorf's hair on them comes down to about mid-forehead, right? And it has like a very narrow thing around the edge, and then it's rows like this. Rows set up in the way that we would currently set up box braid rows. So it is possible that they have like little braids or maybe like little sorry, my brain does not always work well, little dreadlocks, right? Because they're set up in a patterning that we see often within box braid rows and or box braid patterns. And one of the reasons that we use those patterns within box braids is just how easy and concise it makes it. So it could be something like that. The common consensus, though, is that we're looking at a headdress similar to the headdress being worn by the man behind me. Now, there's debate as to what these headdresses signify. There's debate as to whether or not these headdresses are worn by everybody. Whether or not they signify fertility. Are these the midwives of the culture, right? And this signifies what they do as a job. So there is some debate as to what these headdresses signify. And we do only see them so far on goddess statues, so I'm not quite sure whether or not men would have worn them, though this artistic rendition I think is very beautiful. Um, this is a sense of identity, though. This is, I am identifying myself so everybody can see who I am. Now, we do this today. A lot of us don't think that we do this today, but this is why we wear the clothing that we wear. This is why we wear the colors that we wear. This is why we wear the jewelry that we wear. Our clothing is a sense of identity that we express to other people. And from the earliest stages of our decoration of self, it is expressing our identity to another group of people. If you are, of one group of people, maybe you live in an area that has a lot of shells, and so you wear a lot of shells in your body, in your adornment. You cover your clothing with shells. You wear necklaces of shells, and all this other, decoration that you can come up with. We do see that piercings are really far back, so maybe you're piercing your body with these and wearing these shells and piercings, right? Um, so you might be a people of the shell, whereas a group of people who are up in a flint region, and flint is something that they have a heavy access to, might actually wear flint ornaments. They might actually wear, you know, there's flakes that happen when you're flint napping. They might actually wear those little flakes as ornament. They might wear them on their clothing. They might actually, maybe they're cut themselves with flint and leave scarification for flint, right? There might be different ways that they're adorning their body using flint. So they might be the people of the flint, right? So we're seeing that these adornments of our body are signifiers of who we are. They might be signifiers of who we are as a people, or they might be signifiers of who we are as an individual, like what we provide for the community. Biologically, we are nurturing and communal as a species. We have mandatory midwifery, which means we must have community to give birth to our children. And then we have 5 life stages from neonate to adult. We're the only species that does that, which means we must have nurturing from a broad community to raise a child from neonate to an adult. And because of this, we are nurturing and communal as a species. So you see that the idea of what you offer to the community, what you bring to the table to the community, is not about a role that you fit because somebody else told you to fit this role. It's about what sings to you. And so when you're nurturing a child from neonate to adult, you might teach them every different thing you can. Like you might have 30 people in your band, and maybe you have some really good hunters in your band, and maybe you have a really good flint napper, and maybe you have somebody who practices medicine, and maybe you have somebody who's a really good cook, and maybe you have somebody who's a really good basket weaver, right? And so all of these different groups are going to give the child a chance to learn these different things. They might teach them a little flint napping. They might teach them a little basketry. They might teach them a little sewing. They might teach them a little tracking and hunting. And whatever sings to that child, whatever speaks to that child, whatever that child is good at and likes to do becomes that child's contribution to community. Contribution to community and what you contribute to community is important, right? Individual talents are an extremely important thing, not because you get to be an individual, but because each individual talent that you have is something that somebody else in the community doesn't have the ability to contribute, and so you're contributing it to the community. If I can't hunt because I can't track and I'm really loud around animals, which is not the case, I'm a hunter, have been all my life. If I can't hunt, you don't want me out hunting. It doesn't matter what you perceive me to be. You don't want me out hunting if I can't hunt, right? Yet if I can't hunt, but I can do really good with flint napping, that's what you want me to do because I'm going to create better tools for the community as a whole. If I can't sew, but I can really hunt, right? Then that's what you're going to want me to do because that's how I contribute to the community survival as a whole. So individuality is not about being set apart. It's about having specific talents that contribute to the community as a whole. Okay. We've kind of lost this concept. It's become a little bit of a problem, right? So we're seeing groups that have identity, right? That have identity of their community and have identity of self. Yet this identity of their community and identity of self does not lead to violence between, right? There's not this idea that somebody else is taking from me, and so I have to kill them. That comes much later, and it's really a method of control. So when we're looking at the different things that they have, again, we're definitely seeing identity of self. We're seeing things like shell work. We're seeing things like there's 3 different colors that they're using in their cave art. And so we can associate this with three different colors that they're using, or pigment making materials that they're using. And these three different ones that we're seeing is we're seeing ochre, which makes red paint or red dye. We're seeing charcoal, which makes black paint or black dye. And we're seeing a chalk substance that I cannot remember the technical term for, but it creates a very white substance. So we see within the cave art that there's a combination of black and red and white within the cave art. And so we see that some of these substances are definitely being used to decorate the body, because we're seeing things like what we might consider makeup palettes, or stones that have a flat surface where people are mixing these things. And we also see ones that you're carrying with you. So you might have there's a shell that's a necklace that's like a clam shell that you can see the ochre was mixed within. And so this is something that maybe I carry my little nub of ochre in my bag, and I carry my water on my other hip, and I have my necklace that mixes these things. And when I wake up in the morning, I make sure and paint my identity on my body, right? So I grind down a little bit of ochre in my shell, and then I put a little bit of water in that ochre, or maybe some animal fat so it binds a little better. And then I grab that and I rub it in here, and maybe I do half my face in red or something along those lines, so that you can see that I'm part of the ochre clan, right? So we're seeing the self-identity and the identity of community, yet not an interviolence between the two, right? We're also seeing during this time frame that children are very important, that raising your children and ensuring your children are healthy is very important. We are looking at a time frame in humanity where childbirth is not an every year thing, where childbirth is actually controlled. And there are a few different ways that you can control childbirth. You can control childbirth through herbology. You can control childbirth through a lot of times when you're solely nursing, and that's the sole force, sole sustenance for a child, it will delay the fertility, right? And this is one of those natural things put within the human species to ensure that we're not having 5 toddlers in a clan of 30 people and trying to keep 5 toddlers from screaming and bringing in the predators, right? Having 1 toddler is more than enough for any group of 30 people. Just want to state, having 1 toddler is more than enough, having raised 2 at the same time. And so when we're seeing this, we're seeing that there is control in our birthing, so that we're spacing it out, right? You might have a child every 5 years, right? Instead of 1 every year. And you might have a child every 5 years, and somebody else might have a child every 5 years, but you're staggering them a little bit. So you're not having them together so much, so that you don't have 2 or 3 2-year-olds running around. And we're also seeing this idea of animals coming into play as a spirituality thought process, or not necessarily a spirituality. Well, I guess spirituality might be the best term. So most cultures pre-Western thought are animistic cultures. And an animistic culture just looks at the entire biome as being alive. It states that the earth has a life of its own, and it is a living, breathing being, which is pretty obvious if you look around you. And it states that all the animals and all the plants are living, breathing beings, which is pretty obvious if you look around you. And it does not set humanity above, right? It does not say, I'm human, and so you're just here to provide for me. And it doesn't own things that are living and breathing. So it doesn't own the land, it belongs to the land. It doesn't own the animals, it interworks with the animals. It doesn't own the trees, it interworks with the trees, right? And so we see that prior to a Western thought concept of God, right, of God choosing people, whether this is several deities or a singular deity, that the animistic thought process is a pretty global thought process. And so during this time with an animistic thought process, you're looking at people who are working with the earth around them. Now, how do we work with the earth around us? Some people term honorable harvest one of the terms, and it's the one that I most easily associate with. And this is the idea that when you are gathering food, you don't take, like if you're hunting, you don't take the really strong buck that you want to be able to breed with the other does. You take the older buck who's already bred several times with the other does. You take something that is infirm or sick, right? This isn't just because of the fact that it's easier to catch. It's also because of the fact that you're pruning the herd. You're helping the herd grow. If you're taking if someone is within animals, if you have a disabled animal who is no longer able to provide genetics to the herd or protection for the herd, that disabled animal is just feeding, right? And so if we take that disabled animal out of the equation, everybody else within that herd eats better. This is not a reason for eugenics. This is animals, just so you're aware. Everybody else within the community of the animal community is able to provide to get more food, right? And so when we're out hunting as an animistic people, we're not taking the best and the brightest, we're taking those whose time it is, right? And the same thing when it comes to gathering plant life, right? So you're not taking the prettiest and the best and the brightest, you're leaving that to give the next generation, you're leaving that to go to seed so the next generation of the plant can come up, and you're pruning. And this means we all know that life cycles within plants that regrow yearly have a cycle that they're dormant, right? So as they are entering into that dormant phase, you're going to prune from them what you need, and that pruning back actually helps them grow when they enter into their next growth phase. When they leave their dormant phase and enter into their next growth phase, they grow better. Most of us can associate this with roses. Most people know that you want to prune back your roses in the fall so that the next spring that the roses are actually growing better. There's some benefit to this for the rose on many levels. If you have like a bunch of branches on a rose bush, it's more likely that many of those branches are going to get the cold snap and freeze. Yet if you prune all those branches back, the rose bush can hoard all of its resources down into here and hold on to all of its resources and feed itself over the course of the winter without having to go out here to feed itself. They don't have to feed this little tendril that's out here that's probably going to die off before the winter ends anyways, right? So as a tender, I might take a couple of those rose branches so that I can use them for different things that I need. And that is pruning back the plant, which is for the health and the benefit of the plant and the health of the benefit of me. This is how animistic culture tends the environment. This is our niche as a being within the environment. Animistic thought process is that we just fulfill another niche in the biome, like the trees do, like the animals do, like the water does, like the soil does. We fulfill a niche within the environment. And the niche that we fulfill in the environment is the tending of the environment. And this is where tending comes into it, pruning back, right? Now, when we're looking at the way that culture is moving into these areas at this time and settling into these areas at this time, we can see that culture is adapting to these areas at this time. The humans that are moving into this space are adapting. They might adapt their food needs for the space. They might adapt their languages for the space. They might adapt how they build their homes for the space. They might adapt their tools for the space. Let's give a really good example of that. If I come from a space along the Mediterranean, the Levant area, and so my people have been using seafood and seashells for generation upon generation upon generation because we've been there 100,000 years. But I move into the mountains and there's no more sea. Instead of my main dietary source being seafood, my main dietary source might become deer, right? Instead of my main plant source being seaweed, my main plant source might now be any number of different fruits or vegetables as in the areas. It may be berries now, right? And so this is an adaptation to the environment because I'm now living in an environment that doesn't have what my prior environment had, right? Now, in this adaptation to our environment, we see that languages are created, right? This is what indigeneity is. This is how we become indigenous. We move into a space that does not have people in it, right? Or sometimes maybe no longer has the other groups of humans within it, and Homo sapien is the only group of human left, right? So we move into this space, and as we're in this space, our language adapts, our understanding adapts, and our bodies adapt to this space. And in this adaptation, we become indigenous to the space because we start to belong to this space. We are the tenders of this space. We are those who create the health for the space. Because again, our space in the biome is to tend the biome to improve the health of the biome. It's not to take, it's not to eradicate. It is to tend to improve the health, right? And so this is how people become indigenous to a space. They're moving into this space. They're adapting to the environment in this space. They're adapting their language. They're adapting their foods. They're adapting their clothings. They're adapting everything within the space to the space, not adapting the space to them. Now, that doesn't mean that we don't adapt space to us. Of course, we adapt space to us, right? Anytime you're building a house, you're adapting space. Anytime you take a cave and decide to put a wall across the front of it out of stone, you're adapting a space, right? And one thing that's really unique about us as species, one thing that we do that no other species does is we adapt our adaptations. Many other species on this planet have tools, crows, all corvids, many primates, there are beavers build houses, right? There are many other species on this planet that have tools and that will adapt the space to suit them. We take these adaptations that we have made and we adapt them further. This is something very unique to us. So we are absolutely adapting the environment to suit us. Yet in our adaptation of the environment to suit us, we are not destroying the environment to suit us, right? We're tending the environment into a way that will suit us and the environment. We're not invasive to the environment. So we see that part of what the Gravatians are adapting is this concept of anamorphic thought process. This concept of anamorphic thought processes, um, so I get for drinking Red Bull all morning. This anamorphic concept of thought process is I can see the spirit of the animal and the spirit of the human, and the spirit of the human and the spirit of the animal, right? That's that anamorphic thought process. That's why you see statues that have a lion head and a male body. That's why you see anamorphic gods within ancient Kemet, Egypt, right? Um, this concept is that the spirit of the animal is imbued by me as I eat the animal, as I hunt the animal, and that spirit or the strength of the animal that I imbue is therefore something that I carry on. So if I believe that the cave lion, let's go with the lion-headed statue. If I believe that the lion is a very powerful predator, and I believe that if I imbue the spirit of the lion, that I will keep my family safe, that I might go out and hunt a cave lion and kill a cave lion. I might take that cave lion's fur and I might wear it as a helmet. That could be what the anamorphic one is the idea that statue is that he has a cave lion head as a hat, right? And the cave lion is down his back. So I might wear that cave lion as a helmet. I might wear that cave lion's teeth. Um, and all of these things bring that cave lion closer to me. All of these things help me imbue the spirit of the cave lion, the courage of the cave lion, the ability to hunt that the cave lion has, right? And by eating the meat of the cave lion, I am likely to believe that eating the meat of the cave lion actually imbues the spirit of the cave lion within me, right? Um, and so with this, we're seeing this concept of concept of being a part of the environment, right? We're seeing this concept of fitting our space within the biome, right? And we're seeing the concept that all other things around us actually have a spirit, actually have just a same equal thought process of self that we have, right? We're seeing this within the Gravatians. The other thing that we really see starting within the Gravatians is tattooing. This is where we see that our earliest tattooing instruments are found. We see that our earliest tattooing instruments are found in a cave in France at 35,000 years ago. This is what had been thought as a discard flake, but actually has a single point on it. And the single point actually has blood and pigment on it, like a charcoal from herbs. We see with Otzi actually that's what the tattoos are for him. They are burned herbs that were made into a paste that were then tattooed on him, and the herbs are actually associated herbs with the physical issues and ailments that he had, and the tattoos are all along meridian lines that are still used within acupuncture today with Otzi, right? So when we're looking at what they were tattooing, we don't have really a very definitive answer in what the Gravatian peoples are tattooing. The lion-headed anamorphic statue actually has some markings on it that could be associated as tattoos. There's like 5 or 4 lines across an arm here, and these could be associated as tattoos. Many experts in the field of tattooing and the archaeology of tattooing actually associate these as tattoo marks. So this could be a thought process of tattooing. Now, it could be that this person went out and hunted a cave lion and got the cave lion, right? And escaped whole, right? Yet when this person hunted the cave lion and escaped whole, and now they've imbued the spirit of the cave lion, they come back and the tattoo markings they receive are tattoo markings that are associated with the cave lion. And what's associated with the cave lion is the claw marks. And so now you have claw marks tattooed into your upper forearm to show, even when you're not wearing your hat, that you fought the cave lion and you won, right? So these are ideas of what tattooing this could be. If you are looking to try and connect with Gravachian culture and you're looking to do this through tattooing, one thing that I would recommend is taking a look at the cave art during that time period and utilizing the cave art as a tattooing implement. There's to my head, the first one that even comes to mind is a picture of a bison on a cave wall where it's outlined in black. And you see his kind of square head with a couple horns coming out and his big, beautiful body and his front legs, and then it kind of fades. Now you could take that and it's an outline in black with red pigment in the middle. So you could take that piece of artwork and tattoo that piece of artwork on your body with the black outline and the red in the middle. And this could absolutely be a tattoo that connects you to a Gravachian tattoo or Gravachian knowledge, right? You could do, like maybe you've been out hunting and you've come in contact with a couple of cave lions. Hi, Mia. And in doing that, you were able to, imbue the spirit of the cave lion. So maybe you get claw marks tattooed, right? There's a couple of different ideas. I'm trying to make sure that I'm covering all the concepts that I'm trying to cover. Again, we're not just going to cover the Gravachians this time. We're going to start with the Gravachians, but we're going to move down just a little bit. And so when we're looking at the Gravachians, I again want to make sure that I have touched on all the things that we see within the Gravachian culture. We see self-identity and a decoration of self. We see cave art. We see different tool assemblages being used. We see the concept of tailoring clothing, as in clothing that actually fits the body instead of being tied onto the body, with many open spaces that air can come through. And we see movement into space and the start of indigeneity within that space, right? The start of really becoming a part of the biome within the space that you are moving into, right? I do have at least one mod in here, and it is down a little bit low. So I'm going to go ahead and turn on comments for a little while. Again, if you're just coming in, I want to remind everybody that in my chat, we will talk about how race was debunked. The theory of race has been debunked. Race does not exist. Racism exists. Race is a colonial construct. Racism is unfortunately the foundation of many countries that we live in. And I don't really want to deal with your racism in my chat. You can sit and learn and listen as to why race is not there and why racism is bad, or you can scroll on. And I also don't deal with phobias based on gender and desire in my chat. And I also don't want to deal with your religious phobias or your God. Like, keep him out of my chat. We're not talking about him today, right? And that if you think that I'm incorrect about something, that you not tell me I'm a liar or not tell me I'm wrong, tell me why. Sarah, Widda, you're incorrect about this because this article states this instead. Absolutely. I don't know if the myths about humans transforming into animals come from this area. Why do you think I'm incorrect, SCP? Tell me, like, you can think I'm incorrect. I may be. Like, there may be knowledge that you have that I don't have, but tell me why. Tell me what it is that you say that is incorrect, right? My sources are all on widdaord.com. This is my personal website where I compile biographies of the thing, or bibliographies, not biographies. Bibliographies of the things that I discuss. So you can absolutely go to that and find the sources for the things that I have. Oh, okay, you're just fucking with me, and that's okay. But if you're going to tell me that I'm wrong, then you really mean that I'm wrong. I'd like sources. I would like information. You don't have to post your website, but hey, you're wrong about this because this article states this about the Gravachians, or you're wrong about this because this article states this about this, right? Just so that I can actually go and see, am I wrong, right? Sometimes I am. We're all wrong sometimes, right? And I'm also constantly learning new information, right? So I think that the reason that we believe that we can morph into animals is coming from that animistic thought process, that we're just another one of the animals, and the thought process of being able to imbue the spirit of the animals. Now, I don't know if it starts with the Gravachians or if it starts prior, right? We see the animistic thought process of being a part of the animal world going back to the very, very, very beginning of us, right? We see that predate us even. We see that within Neanderthals. We see that within other species, right? The idea that we're just a part of the animal world. And the idea that by eating something, you imbue its spirit as something that we see go back far too, right? It's something that really is in the beginning of us, right? And so I'm not sure if this is where we're seeing the start of it, or if it's something that we see starting earlier. It is probably a continuation of it, I would state. We are absolutely seeing that concept, though. The concept that by imbuing the spirit of an animal, you become that animal, you imbue some of who that animal is, and you can express some of that spirit of the animal is actually coming in there. The idea of things like berserkers or shapeshifters or things like that. I'm not sure if we're seeing these because we don't have documentation of it, right? And we don't have like cave art that shows you shifting from human into animal. So I'm not sure if we're seeing that concept here already. Or if that concept comes later. No, the picture is of a Gervasian. So at this point, Europeans are all black. At 40,000 years ago, any Homo sapien that is in Europe is black, or what we would describe today as phenotypically black. Okay. And so the reason that we have this person behind us is that this person is a Gervasian from a culture that is 40,000 to 30,000 years ago, between 40,000 and 30,000 years ago. This is the first Europeans after Neanderthals have been enveloped within us and are no longer a whole species. And so this group moving into Europe at this point of time, and only having been in European spaces for about 10,000 years, are still very dark of skin and very phenotypically what we would call black. And all sapiens start as black, absolutely. So we're not seeing light skin come within Homo sapiens until probably, I guess it's 20,000 years after the end of the Gervasian period. Light skin really starts to come into our species after 10,000 years ago. And we don't really see light skin within our species before 10,000 years ago. And this is because this is an adaptation for a low light environment. So we see phenotypical white people starting even at 10,000 years ago in Britain, we don't see phenotypical white people. So we see that there is a presence enough to be warranted in the population roughly 5,000 years ago, right? That doesn't mean that they're the majority of the population, and it is blue eyes first and low melanin later. And we see that that presence starts to rise like 5,000 years ago. We see that by 3,000 years ago, you might see maybe 50% of the population. By 2,000 years ago, we're seeing like 80% of the population is light of skin in Northwest Europe. And we're seeing by 1,000 years ago within the Viking sagas that still 10% of the population is dark of skin. We can see within the sagas that Egil Skallagrimsson is actually dark of skin. And there are many people in the sagas who are spoken of as being dark of skin. So we actually see dark skin within the Nordic areas up until the time of the sagas as being a part of the culture and as being, not typical, right? 10% isn't typical yet as being within the culture, right? And so, and yes, well, and again, we all start black because we all start as sapiens in Africa. In Africa, having darker skin, so we all have melanin within our skin, everybody. The higher concentration of melanin, the darker the skin. And the higher concentration of melanin protects from overdose due to vitamin D, and it also protects from burning. That does not mean that people who are darker skin don't burn. They absolutely do. It means that they don't burn as easily as people who are lighter skin. And so if you're in a high sun content environment, having dark skin is the benefit. Having dark eyes is a benefit as well, because eyes are the same thing. It's a concentration of melanin within your eyes. So the lighter the eyes, the less melanin. The darker the eyes, the more melanin. And the darker eyes and higher melanin actually keeps light out somewhat. So if you're in a high light environment, not as much light is getting in, so it's not blinding you. And the tightly coiled hair that we develop with is because of the fact that the tightly coiled hair will create a kind of shade over the head, and then it creates a lattice work for air to get through, and that lattice work cools the brain. We see that light eyes are the first things. Yes. And if you read the sagas, you'll see that in the sagas. Light eyes are the first things that start to develop within us. And the reason that light eyes are within Europeans, and the reason that light eyes are the first things that start to develop within people in the European region is because light eyes are an adaptation for low light. They allow more light into the eye. And by allowing more light into the eye, it makes it easier to see in a low light environment. So when you're dealing with predators, you're dealing with the ability to see your predators easier, right? Um, so uh, when we're looking at the movement in at this point of time, we're absolutely looking at people who are all on the darker range of skin. And Neanderthals are considered to have been on the lighter range. I want to define here that when I talk about the darker skin versus the lighter skin, we're talking about a range. Okay. When we're talking about the Neanderthals, we see that Neanderthals are ranging from light to mid-level dark, right? And when we see, when we're talking about Homo sapiens, we're talking about a group that is ranging from dark to mid-level dark, right? So we're not looking at people all being the exact same color. We're looking at a range, okay? And when we're looking at Neanderthals, we're looking at a group of people who are speciating in a low light environment. And because they're speciating in that low light and cold environment, they're actually speciating lighter skin. There's some evidence that light skin actually will help retain heat as well. Like the lighter the color actually helps retain heat more, and the darker the color helps dissipate heat more, right? So and with all of these, and it should be understood, and it's not frequently with all of these are as necessarily based on genetics as they are based on environment. And even when we have a species that is, for the most part, dark of skin, there are still children born who are light of skin. And even when we have a species that is, for the most part, light of skin, we still have children who are born dark of skin. Um, we see that even today, two Black parents can have a white child, phenotypically Black, have a phenotypically white child, and two white parents can have a phenotypically Black child. A famous case of this is from South Africa, and it is the Sandra Lang case. And you can watch a movie about it, you can read books about it. So this is something that absolutely fluctuates. And we also know today that it is as much the environment that the mother is pregnant in that dictates the color of the child's skin as it is genetics. So your genetics have some indication of what alleles are going to be present in the child when they're born, whether it's dark skin alleles or light skin alleles. There's like 9 or 10 different alleles that attribute to skin. And most of us have all of them, just some of them are more visible, right? And you can have a dark skin allele and a light skin allele and be dark skin or light skin, right? And we also are seeing that if a mother is a lighter mother who is carrying a child in a high sun content environment, she will have a darker child. Now, this does not mean that if we have a Northwest European white woman going to South Africa and standing on the sun, she's going to have a Kenyan dark child. What this means is that this white woman might have a child who is a few shades darker, more Mediterranean looking, right? And this is because our skin tone is very much based on an adaptation to the environment that we're in. And that adaptation starts within the womb. And adaptations take generations to happen. But through the course of those generations that they're happening, you're seeing the shades changing. You're seeing these things changing, right? So when we are looking at this, it's important to understand that we're not talking, everybody is the same shade, we're talking ranges and scales, right? Um, Yet we see when people are moving into Scandinavia, we see that there are two groups that settle Scandinavia at the same time. One group is dark of skin and light of eye, and they're coming from the southern part of Europe. And the other group is dark of eye and light of skin, and they're coming from the steppes. This is a Finno-Ugric language speaking group, and the other one is an Indo-European language speaking group. The Finno-Ugric language speaking group, light of skin and dark of eye, is the Sami, and the Indo-European language speaking group, dark of skin and light of eye, that is actually the Swedish today, or the Scandinavians today that we think of who are extremely light of skin and light of eye, right? And so when we're looking at this movement through, we are looking at people who are coming in who have not adapted to the area yet. I want to point out at this point of time that the really cool thing is that we can adapt for environment, right? That's the genetic advantage. And when we're looking at shades of skin tone, one shade of skin tone works everywhere and the other one doesn't. Black skin works everywhere. Dark skin works everywhere. There's not an environment on this planet that dark skin is not beneficial. There are environments on this planet that light skin is not beneficial. You can absolutely overcome the lack of vitamin D with plant. You cannot overcome the high level of sun with extremely light skin with plants, right? So when we're looking at this, we're definitely seeing that it's an adaptation. Now, adaptations take 100 generations, roughly 2,500 years currently, maybe 30,000 years ago, roughly 2,000 years. And again, that does not mean I've gone from very dark to very light in 100 generations. It means that I've moved across the scale. I've gone from here to here, and then to here the next 100 generations, and then to here. It is an adaptation for environment, and it is helpful in certain environments. It does not mean that the other tones of skin aren't okay in other environments. It means that this might be more helpful in this environment. And again, this adaptation is a part of becoming indigenous to an environment, indigenous to a biome. This adaptation is about becoming a part of a biome and being healthy within that biome, right? So as we are looking through, I don't know what you think is revisionism. I'm talking science. And I've also seen the comment that I'm Afrocentric. We all start in Africa. And I've also seen the comment that I'm trying to revise the thought process to be more Afrocentric. And I would state that your racism needs to go elsewhere. If you have an issue with the fact that we all started Black, that's your racism. That's not my knowledge, and that's not the knowledge of science. That's your racism. And if you're dealing with your racism, take it somewhere else, because we're not within a racist space. We're not going to allow your racism within my space, right? Now, I've also seen a couple other comments that I want to address. So, multi-regional theory is the idea that other species of humans develop across the globe, right? That other species of humans develop across the globe. These other species of humans are not Homo sapien. Homo sapien absolutely develops in Africa. These other species of human beings, like Neanderthals or Denisovans or Homo florensis, or the ghost species that we see, are actually intermixing with us. So when you have groups of people like Turtle Island Indigenous people who think that they're or not who think, whose creation stories say that they speciated here, they are telling the truth, because a part of their genome speciated here. We have proof of Homo erectus coming here and proof of Homo erectus speciating here. So the part of the Native American genome that speciated here is from here. They still have the Homo sapien genome that speciates in Africa and is out of Africa for quite some period of time before it gets here, and then comes here and mixes with the genome that is here, the ghost species genome that is here. So in part, they speciate here. This proves the creation stories of many Turtle Island Indigenous and Abyssinian Indigenous peoples, okay? And yet we are still all one species, because the majority of our DNA is all Homo sapien DNA. I think the top amount of other species that you're going to find within a Homo sapien DNA might be somebody in Asia who not only has 5% Neanderthal DNA, but has 1 to 2% Denisovan DNA, meaning they have roughly 7% DNA from other species, right? That's the top that you're going to see. So we all share about 95% of our DNA with every other sapien on the planet, right? Just like we all share 95% of our DNA with bananas. So when we're looking at this, it is important to note that Indigenous groups' origin stories are very often correct. And when we're talking about Indigenous groups within the Turtle Islands or Abayala, who are talking about having originated here, multi-regional speciation in this context is absolutely correct, because there is a species that speciated here that is a part of the genome of Turtle Island Indigenous people and Abayalian Indigenous people. That does not mean that Homo sapien as a species does not start in Africa. We start in Africa as a species, okay? Now, the out of Africa theory has been debunked, because the out of Africa theory stated that half of the species leaves Africa at 150,000 years ago and never goes back, and that half of the species that left Africa advances further than this half of the species that stays in Africa. It's an extremely racist thought process. And we now know that there are several different migrations out of Africa and back into Africa, that there's a constant influx and a constant movement because our species is constantly moving. Our species is constantly moving, right? So, yeah, I know it's gotten high again. And I do think I really only have one person in here right now. I think Saba, did I put you in as a mod? Do I have more than one mod in here? If you're a mod in here, can you go ahead and uh, state that you are, just so that I know that I have enough people? Okay. And I know Mia's in here. And so I want to make sure that I have at least a couple of mods in here. If it starts to get bad, please let me. Okay, perfect. Would you pin that when you go so that I know? And could you pin, if it starts to get mad, would somebody, or if it starts to get bad, would somebody pin a comment to me so that I can see? And I'll go ahead and turn them off again, just so that we can, make sure that it's healthy for everybody in here and that it's a safe space within here, because we know that it can get very unsafe within here. And I want to make sure, because I'm not paying too much attention to the comments, that it doesn't get unsafe and that I'm not missing an unsafe environment for people, right? So when we're looking at people moving into space within Europe, we are absolutely looking at Homo sapiens who have come from Africa, who have gone back and forth, and who are darker skin as they're moving into Eurasia. When we're looking at the Europeans, and this is what we're speaking about specifically today, not necessarily about paleoanthropology, when we're looking at the Europeans, awesome. When we're looking at the Europeans moving in, again, we're looking at a group that's moving in with thought process. And we're looking at the thought processes having an animistic sense of belonging to the environment, attending of the environment, a coexistence with the environment. And yet we are also seeing at this point of time, identity has arisen. We see that identity arises roughly 100,000 years ago. And the idea of identity of self and the idea of identity of community. And again, when we're looking at identity of self, we're not looking at I'm unique, I'm individual, I'm put up here. We're looking at I have these talents and I bring them to the community. My talents are beneficial to the community. It is not being set aside. It is not being set apart. It is not being individualistic. It is about being communal with individual talents, because each individual talent contributes to community as a whole. So we've talked about the Gravatians. We've talked about moving in. We're talking about how that they're working within these spaces as they're moving in, but let's take it down a little bit. After the Gravatians, we start to see different cultures moving in. Now, first we see that there is a small ice age, and that small ice age drives the Gravatians down. And when we see the Gravatians coming out of that small ice age, the Y-DNA of the Italian Peninsula Gravatians has changed. And that Y-DNA, there's a couple different. One is coming from Turkey, and one is coming from the Gravatians over kind of midway between the Italian Peninsula and the Iberian Peninsula. So we see that the Gravatians are pretty much the lower Eurasian area, lower Western Europe at this point of time. They're in the Italian Peninsula, along the border of the Mediterranean and on the Iberian Peninsula. And as the ice is receding, they're moving back up. And as they're moving back up, they're taking a little bit of new DNA when we're looking at the Italian Peninsula Gravatians. As they're moving back up into these regions, this is the end of the last ice age. And so this is when we really start to see settling happen that stays settled. Okay. And again, we're also looking at a time period where Neanderthals are no longer their own species. They're a part of our species, but they're not a whole species that's living aside us. They're just mixed into our species, like genetically. And so as we're moving into these spaces and we're becoming settled into these spaces are empty. And these spaces are needing attending, and they're environments that we become really settled within and become a part of. Now we see that even as we take this down to like the Celts and the Germanic peoples, we're seeing that there might be different pockets of a specific culture that have different DNAs, or there might be a specific culture that has several, like we see like with the Bell Beakers, that the Bell Beakers are in 3 separate spaces, yet they all have the same culture, yet they all have different DNA lines, mitochondrial and Y DNA lines. At this point, when we're talking about DNA, what we're talking about is lineage based on mitochondrial DNA and lineage based on Y DNA. So this is going to be before Proto-Indo-European. So what languages that we're using at this time is not something that I can really define. The oldest languages that we have on this planet are the Kwai languages and the Australian languages. These languages have a lot of nature sounds within them, clicks, trills, chirps. All of these are uh, taking the language that we hear in the environment around us of other animals and incorporating it into our languages, right? So the languages that we're speaking at this time are likely to be similar to the oldest languages that we have currently on the planet. I know that like the Kwai language is thought to be 70, 80,000 years old, right? And so it might be similar to that. It's not going to be the same, right? But it might be. And that is that word, though, the KHOISAN is considered a slur by the Kwai people. And so that's why I don't use it. Kwai is QU, not QU, key, fuck my head. KWEA, I believe, is the Kwai spelling. And it's a way to pronunciate it if you cannot click without actually using what was attributed to them as their language by Europeans coming in, right? Or who they were. Like the Sioux are not the Sioux, they're the Lakota, Dakota, Nakota, right? Sioux is a European word that is attributed to the Sioux. Khoisan is a European word that is attributed to the Khoi people because of the fact that the Europeans couldn't pronounce the word that the way that needed to be pronounced, and they didn't respect or listen, right? So they did not actually migrate out of Africa. They are still within Africa. That does not mean that their language might not be similar to the language that you see outside of Africa starting, right? So when you're looking at the languages moving and adapting, and if we're looking at our oldest languages being these two different groups of the oldest language, and Indigenous Australians have been in Australia for like 70,000 years. They're the oldest outside of Africa. And the Khoi people are at least 70,000 years as a culture. I believe that it actually goes back 120,000 years as a culture. Like I believe that there are cultural centers that are 120,000 years. So we're looking at our two oldest cultures on the planet that are continuous, right? And so they are maintaining the languages, not exactly how they were. I'm sure that there's many adaptations that come along with language as time comes, right? Like Indo-European and Proto-Indo-European and Indo-European and European are three. They don't always sound the same. They just root the same, right? So you might have a rooting within the Khoi language, but it doesn't mean that the Khoi language is what is being taken in. It is something that, like by this time, you're most likely to see that the Gravachian people probably haven't had, if you're looking at the southern tip of a continent versus, way up here, you may not have had direct interchange. There would still have been some interchange, but there might not have been direct interchange for the last 10,000 years. So the language has adapted, right? So whether or not that's where the root language comes from, it doesn't mean that it hasn't adapted significantly, and it's probably not very recognizable by where the root language was from at that period of time, any more than ancient Irish Gaelic is really recognizable today, or ancient Proto-Indo-European would be recognized today. Indigenous Turtle Islanders and Indigenous Abiyalians have been in Turtle Island and Abiyala for at least 50,000 years. And that does not count the ghost species, the lineage that comes from the species that speciated from Homo erectus here in Turtle Island and in Abiyala, which was here at least 250,000 years ago. And that ghost species is within Indigenous Turtle Islanders and Indigenous Abiyalians. So a part of their genome has been here for 250,000 years. The Homo sapiens of Turtle Island and Abiyala have been here for at least 50,000 years. This is a southern boat route through the islands of the South Pacific. So when we're looking at that, we are looking at an extremely old culture who has been here for thousands and thousands of years and actually has been in Turtle Island and in Abiyala longer than Homo sapien has been in most of Europe or most of Eurasia. So they have been here for an extended period of time. We do not see that Homo sapien make it to the island of Britain until about 14,000 years ago. So by that time, indigenous Turtle Islanders have been here for like 25,000 years, 35,000 years. So they are absolutely an extremely old culture here within Turtle Island. Awesome. Thank you, Mia. So I'll keep an eye out and make sure it doesn't get too bad and try not to comment. So and it is since time immemorial, and because we as indigenous Turtle Islanders have a species here that's speciated here, it is absolutely since time immemorial, right? Um, as we're looking at Europeans, though, because that is our concentration today, again, a big part of this is to help people who are of European descent figure out how to decolonize and connect to their ancestors without appropriating other culture. I was asked by many communities and many communities that I belong to and members of communities that I belong to please help Europeans, allies, and accomplices find their own ancestral connection, because that is what allies and accomplices have been asking, is to find their own ancestral connection without appropriating other cultures. So this is about helping people who are not Turtle Island indigenous, do not have African roots, find the culture and the ancestral connection that they need to, because they don't want to appropriate culture. So that is why the focus today is in Europe. We absolutely have had a couple of different sidetracks, right? And we're probably always going to have a couple of different sidetracks. As somebody who is Turtle Island indigenous with African ancestry, it is important to have many of these sidetracks. Many of these sidetracks are extremely important to my ancestors as well as to all of our ancestors, right? So some of these sidetracks are important, but what we are focusing on today is European indigeneity, so Europeans can find that connection without appropriation, right? And that does not mean that you cannot be Turtle Island indigenous and benefit from indigenous European knowledge, right? Or be Black or be African. And those are two different things, right? Because Black in America and African are two different things, right? Because Black in America is descendant from Africa, but it is its own culture currently, right? So it does not mean that you cannot be of African descent and still have European ancestry that you're trying to connect to. Does not mean that you can't have a European ancestry from everywhere or from anywhere and you'd be mixed with something else and you're trying to connect to those Europeans. So this isn't only for people who are completely, it is for everybody, yet it is a focus on helping people reconnect their European ancestry without cultural appropriation of other ancestries. So when we're looking at this movement down and this movement into space over time, right? As this movement into space over time happens, we're starting to see people become indigenous to this space. Again, as they're becoming indigenous to this space, they're adapting and they're adapting the space. Now, we're not seeing animistic cultures adapting the space to the extent that we see adaptation of space today, right? Most animistic cultures believing that they're a part of the biome, believing that they belong to the land instead of the land belonging to them, believing that animals and plants have as much of a spirit and a reason for breathing and being given rights as anything else. We see that animistic cultures do not tend to destroy the environment; they tend to become a part of the environment. So the adaptations that they're using within the environment tend to be cohesive with the biome, right? So instead of putting down huge concrete statues, you might find lathe woven houses covered with animal hides, something that is going to biodegrade back into the environment swiftly and easily when they move on, right? So this is about connection with the environment, not about stomping on the environment, not overdoing the environment, right? And so these are things that are extremely important when we're looking. You mean you're going to report my live about teaching European people their European ancestry? Well, I've also taught how Turtle Island indigenous people have been here as sapiens for 50,000 years. And as the prior species that was here, that speciated here, as according to many Turtle Island indigenous cultural stories, have been here for 250,000 years and have speciated here, you're going to try and report this for Indigenous Eraser. A Turtle Island indigenous person who is trying to ensure that people aren't appropriating Turtle Island indigenous culture or African indigenous culture, you're going to report it as Indigenous erasure. You can go ahead and report it as Indigenous erasure 100%. Go right the fuck ahead, because you're going to see that that's not what's happening here, and nobody is going to cancel my live because you reported it for Indigenous erasure when they actually listen to the live that is telling you that it is not okay to erase or appropriate culture. That's true. I should. You're right. And absolutely, I need that. 1 second, YouTube. I was actually told that I need to start screenshotting these things, right? So I'm sorry. That's just extremely amusing. I've literally, I mean, obviously you've never come across me before, and obviously you don't know me, right? Because you would know that that is actually the exact opposite of everything I do within here. So have fun and go right along with it. You're going to see that that's just not going to work the way you want it to, right? So again, back on trying to show European people what their own ancestry is so that European people can find their own ancestry and reconnect to their own ancestors so that they're not appropriating culture, so that they're not erasing cultures. Let's go back to that, right? So as we're looking at becoming indigenous to space for Europeans and how Europeans are moving into the space, adapting to the space, we're seeing that there are certain things that are absolutely cross-cultural in all animistic thought processes. If you are animistic, animistic believes or means that you believe that you're belonging to the environment, not the environment belongs to you. Animistic believes that you are at one with nature, you're a part of the biome, your job within the biome is nurturing and tending. You're just another animal. The earth has as many rights. The earth is its own entity and its own soul, and other animals and other plants are their own entity and their own soul. This is cross-cultural for animism. That is what animism means. So anything that is an animistic culture has these thought processes and traditions. Almost every culture across the globe is animistic prior to the advent of Western thought and prior to the takeover of the concept that by convincing you to hate everybody but the person who is ruling you in a negative way, that I can maintain control over you and I can hoard from you. Okay, so that's where Western thought comes in at like 10,000 years ago. Everything prior to Western thought coming into 10,000 years ago is culture that is based on being a part of who you are, right? Being a part of the environment, being a part of the biome, right? Cro-Magnon is actually just a name for a specific skull of a modern human who's only 30,000 years ago. So Cro-Magnon isn't, Cro-Magnon is actually autonomous, not going to be able to say it again today, autonomically modern human. So Cro-Magnon is just us at 30,000 years ago. So when we are looking at how they're moving into the space with animistic culture, this is where it becomes important. Moving into a space with an animistic culture and becoming a part of the biome in the space, right, means that you are adapting your language to that space. We were just talking about, we don't know exactly where these languages started at. They're most likely are starting, in the same space, in the same time as some of the oldest languages that we currently have on Earth right now. And as those languages are adapting in space, they adapt to the space. I come from the Pacific Northwest. We have 20 words for rain in the Pacific Northwest. Why do we have 20 words for rain in the Pacific Northwest? Because you want to know what kind of rain it is before you go outside, and I'm going to tell you, right? I'm going to tell you if it's misting or drizzling or sheeting or sleeting. I'm going to tell you if it's pouring. I'm going to tell you, what type of rain you're going to experience when you're going outside so you can dress appropriately. So we have 20 words for rain. Many cultures will have the words for the plant will say exactly what that plant does. Eye bright works for your eyes, right? Feverfew will help lower your fever. Many animistic terms or indigenous terms for plants will dictate to tell you exactly what that plant does, because that way it's easier for, if I tell you that, you've got a fever, feverfew works for fevers, right? So, and as we're looking at that, we're seeing that this adoption into this space and this adoption of language in this space is really important to how we're interacting with the space, right? How we're interacting with the space. Egil Skallagrimsson, who is probably the most famous Viking we have, was black, right? So when we are adapting into this space and we're adapting our language to the space, we're also adapting the way we interact with space. Again, if you come from a space where you were on the Mediterranean Sea and you move to the mountains, you have to adapt what your foods are. You have to adapt how you're interacting. Egil Skallagrimsson, he's from Egil Saga. He's like one of the most famous Vikings, and he was dark. Like it's documented he was dark. It's in the sagas. It's Egil's saga, and it's in the sagas that he was dark, like he's described as dark. And there are actually several Vikings within the sagas that are dark. Egil Skallagrimsson from Egil's saga, Egils. So when we're adapting into this space and we're adapting the way we're eating and we're adapting the different things that we need within this space, like if I come from a space that has maple trees, no, not maple trees. If I come from a space that has oak trees, I've probably used oak within all of the different things that I've been doing. Yet if I move into a space that has cedar and no oak, I'm going to use cedar and not oak, right? Because that is what's in that space. Now, as I'm using cedar instead of oak, I'm going to note that there are differences between cedar and oak, right? Oak is not something that I would use for air cleansing, A. Oak is a harder wood, B. I might be able to make spears from it easier, right? Cedar is a softer wood. I'm less likely to be able to make spears that are actually going to work, right? I'm also might note that cedar actually provides a few different things. Oak is going to provide me acorns. Cedar is not going to provide me something that I can really eat from the tree, right? Yet it will provide me with cedar boughs, which might be something that I can use for smoke cleansing. I can probably use cedar boughs to cover a house better than I can use oak boughs, because oak boughs aren't as tightly woven in the way that the bough works as a cedar bough is, right? So there's a couple of different things that I might adapt because I'm used to oak and I'm used to being able to use it for acorns and I'm used to being able to use it for spears, but none of that stuff applies here. So now I have to find a different thing to use for my spears, a different wood to use for my spears. I no longer have oak. I need something that's going to work for that. And instead of having acorns, I might have to, maybe there's pine in the area. And so I'm going to use pine nuts instead of acorns, right? So we're adapting what we're doing and how we're utilizing the environment based on the environment. One of those adaptations is going to be skin color and eye color. Again, we do not see the adaptation for skin color come until well after the adaptation for eye color for low light environments. We do not see that skin color becomes more light of skin until after 10,000 years ago. We start to see it really coming into the society in little pockets, right? But we don't see Hayami. We don't see it as a prevalence in society until well after 5,000 years ago, probably about 4,000 years ago, 3,000 years ago, we start to see that half of the society is light of skin, right? And again, by the time we get to the Vikings, we're still seeing that roughly 10% of society in Northern European regions is still dark of skin. Again, the light eye adaptation comes before the skin adaptation comes because of the fact that I need to be able to see predators. And light eye adaptation is an adaptation for low light environments so that I can see better. It allows more light in. Like the skin, the eyes are, the color of them has to do with how much melanin is in those spaces, right? So if I have more melanin, my skin or my eyes are going to be darker. If I have less melanin, my skin or my eyes are going to be lighter, right? And this is an adaptation for space along an equatorial region having to do with the light in an area, right? Thank you. Oh, my brother's birthday, who's also a veteran, is today. He was born today, and my ex-husband actually was born today. But my brother and my ex-husband are actually, and they're both veterans, actually, like I am. And that's actually how I met my ex-husband. But happy Veterans Day to you as well, from yesterday. So when we're interacting with this environment, as animistic cultures, when you're interacting with an environment, you utilize what's in the environment. Again, we might see that the herbal usage is going to change depending on the environment. Feverfew is in some areas, but feverfew isn't in all areas. Um, the herbs that we're using to control our childbirth, because we are using herbs to control our childbirth, are going to be different in specific areas. The herbs that we're using to heal are going to be different in specific areas, right? So as we're adapting in these different areas, we're adapting our herbal use, we're adapting our language, we're adapting our physicality, and we're adapting what we're eating, right? And we're adapting how we're utilizing the environment, because we're adapting our needs by the environmental's gives, right? So if my need is housing, I'm going to use what's in the environment to meet this need. If my need is clothing, I'm going to utilize what's in the environment to meet my need. With animistic cultures, in that thought process that we are all just a part of the environment, you're going to see that a few things also correlate. For the vast majority of cultures prior to colonization, and even some after colonization, we see that smoke cleansing is something that's very prevalent. The idea that burning herbs will actually cleanse germs from the air is a scientific thought process that goes back prior to Western thought. It is actually really real. Like, I mean, you can absolutely cleanse the air by different herbs that you're using. And so we see that this is something within animistic cultures that goes back pretty far. So smoke cleansing is one of those things that if you're trying to connect to your ancestors, you can absolutely use. Now, if you're trying to connect to your ancestors without appropriating from other cultures and you want to utilize smoke cleansing, there's ways to do this without appropriating from other cultures. So if you want to use smoke cleansing and you know that your ancestors come from Europe, and you don't know what part of Europe they come from, you might use European sage to smoke cleanse. There's European sage as opposed to like white sage and the different sages here in Turtle Island. So you might use European sage to smoke cleanse. If you know that they come from France, you might use lavender to smoke cleanse. This is something that is pretty prevalent in France. If you know that they come from Europe again, but you don't know where, you might use rose. Rose is a really global thing, and it is used in smoke cleansing. How are you going to do this and actually do it without actually appropriating a different culture? So abalone is something that you can find globally. So using an abalone shell is not necessarily an appropriation of culture. Yet many of us associate abalone shells with Turtle Island indigenous people. So maybe you don't want to use an abalone shell because even if you know that it's, abalone is where your ancestors were from too, you still don't want to use it because it doesn't feel right to you. So there are different ways that you can use a foundation instrument to burn your stuff in. Now, maybe you find a stone from that area. Maybe you've gone online and you find a really beautiful flat rock that somebody's selling and you decide to use that. Maybe you look a little bit further down the line and you look to when glass or iron becomes prevalent in that area and you start using a glass bowl or an iron bowl, right? Maybe you are going to try and keep it as far back as you can using modern techniques. So maybe you get a shell out of glass and you have a glass shell that you're using. Maybe you want, there's clam shells that are really like, maybe you know that your ancestors come from the Italian peninsula. There's a lot of mollusks and a lot of clams that are really popular in the Italian peninsula and they're indigenous to that area. So maybe you use one of those shells, right? It is important to note that using iron and using glass is going to connect you to different stages, right? So using iron and using glass, iron is, like 4,000 years old, right? Metalwork is relatively recent. Iron actually might be earlier or later than that. And metalwork, because I know metalworking goes back 4,000 years in certain places in Europe, but ironwork, I think, actually comes a little bit later. And then so you're looking at a specific space when it's developed, right? Now you could go and get gold that has been like hammered out because that's something that we've been doing for a long time. You could go and get iron that you're actually, you want to connect to that specific period of time, right? The indigeneity within that specific period of time. Um, Africa, iron is actually pretty prevalent if you're connecting with African ancestry. Iron actually, I know. So I personally, I mean, I connect with some African gods because that's what I've been taught to connect with. Yet I don't practice overall African faith. I'm very intersectional in my faith, which is why I don't actually like teach people how, like you got to kind of find your own way through. I'll teach you some of the shit, but I can't give you all the exacts because mine is so mixed, right? But I know people who only practice African faith, and their practicing of African faith, iron is actually an extremely important thing within their practice of their ancestors' faith, right? So you will find cultures where iron is an extremely, extremely important factor. And so if you belong to a culture where iron is an extremely important factor throughout the gods and throughout their history, then absolutely you want to go ahead and use it, right? Ogun, yeah, yeah. I actually the I Oshun is the goddess that I follow from African culture, the one that I've been taught of and been told I'm supposed to. Been told by my siblings who are African that that is the goddess that I'm supposed to be following. So that's where I incorporate my African ancestry. And I do know that she is more water and less iron, but I do know, and I had to hear the word to really get it. But yeah, that there is a god that is directly associated within African culture with iron. So again, going back to the European culture, right? When we're looking at the European culture, you're going to see that iron is something that's coming later, and you're going to see that glass is absolutely something that is coming later, right? With that, when you're looking at it, again, you can incorporate iron and glass and still go early. Like, so say you want to connect to your Gervasian ancestry, but you want to do smoke cleansing. You know that they smoke cleanse, yet you don't know what they're using for smoke cleansing, or you can't find access to things. Maybe you know that they were using a specific type of shell for smoke cleansing, and you don't want to, you can't get access to that shell. So instead of using that shell, you might use a glass representation of that shell. So, how I recommend that you learn about your ancestry for this stuff, especially when you're looking at being in a diaspora. Um, Most people have some idea of where their ancestors were brought here from, whether their ancestors were brought here or whether their ancestors came here. If you're of European ancestry, mainly, you might know, my ancestors came from Ireland, or my grandma came over escaping, the famine in Ireland, or my ancestors came over escaping the Huguenots in France, or my ancestors came over escaping Nazi Germany, right? So you might know, and if it's escaping Nazi Germany, that might mean that you're Judaic, or it might mean that you're Germanic and you couldn't handle what was going on, or maybe your ancestors had one of the other defects that the Nazis were offing, right? So you can go, okay, so my ancestors came escaping the Huguenots in France. So I know that my ancestors were from France. So now that doesn't necessarily mean that your ancestors had always been in France. That is what you know for this time period. And so I would take things that are relative to France. So lavender might be something that I use to smoke cleanse with. If I'm looking at the trees in that area, so once you know what area that your ancestry most likely comes from, the next step for you to take is, what practices do you want to incorporate, right? Do you want to incorporate an animistic practice? And do you want that animistic practice to incorporate the anamorphism, right? So if you want that animistic practice to incorporate anamorphism, you might start getting different things that will connect you to the animals in that area, right? So I come from the Seal people, right? And that is from my Irish ancestry, right? And actually, it's my Finnic ancestry through the Irish ancestry, right? Because of the Selkies, right? So I come from the people of the seal. And because I come from the people of seal, I incorporate seal skin into some of my practices, right? And so maybe you're looking at France and you know that within France there is a presence of red deer. And I really don't know the animals of France, so I could completely be off on the presence of these animals. But maybe you realize that there's a presence of red deer in your studying. And so maybe you start looking for antlers, or maybe you start looking for teeth, or maybe you start looking for hooves, or maybe you start looking for fur. You can go online these days and get that a lot of the times. Um, well, most animistic practices are reciprocal and they believe in barter and trade and not money. Unfortunately, a lot of us are still going to have to utilize money today. So maybe you go and you want to get teeth from deer in France. And so you go online and you find a butcher in France who is selling things, right? And so you buy these teeth and you have them sent. Now you have these teeth, they come from France, they have that connection to this space, and you want to incorporate them. First thing that I would recommend is some form of cleansing, just because of the fact that you had the process of buying in the exchange of capitalism to get to this space, and because you don't know all the people that handled this to this space, and you don't know whether or not this was an honorable harvest, whether or not this was done right. So at that point, you might want to take salt, which is a global thing, and you might want to bury those teeth in salt so that you can. Personally, myself, as I'm doing this, I would be talking to the spirit of that animal. If you were not harvested in a good way, I want to apologize for that. I want you to know that you are loved and honored and respected in my space. I want you to know how much I value you. I want you to know the gratitude I have for having given up your life so that people could eat and so that I could have this piece of you. So the first thing that you want to do is honor that animal, honor whatever it is that you got, to cleanse anything that was negative that got to the point of you getting it, right? And then buried in salt, put it out underneath the moon for a month. There are a couple of different ways that you can do the cleansing process, right? You could actually like put them in like a little bag and take your shell that you've created of glass that you have underneath it, and take your rose that you're using, or your, because it's France, your lavender that you're using, and you light the lavender or the rose underneath, and you let the smoke, carry up over, right, the bag, and give that healing to the bag and to that animal that was there, right? So there are many different ways that you can do that cleansing. In any of this, do what sings. In any of this, do what sings to you. Okay. Now, when I state do what sings to you, if you are not from the West Coast of the United States indigenously and it sings to you to use white sage, you need to inspect what is singing to you. Right? If it sings to you because of this, if it sings, you can try, but actually, like, you can try shutting me down. You wouldn't be the first, Troll King. I have been here for a year, and I have been on account warning 99.9% of that. So try. So when something sings to you, if you know it's not your connection and it's singing to you, you're not doing it right, and you need to reinvestigate. Okay. And you need to maybe sit with yourself a little bit, right? Oh, hold on just a second. There's a knock at the door. Hey, come on in. Absolutely. Let me go get on my live. I'm in the middle of live. No, you're fine. You're fine. Family has come. My brother and my dad are here, so I'm going to go ahead and take up. Hey, Fable. Actually, original Europeans were black. We all started black. All of us, all of us, all of us. Turtle Island indigenous people, by the time Columbus got here, were not black phenotypically, just so we make sure that one's doubled down. But I am going to go. Before I go, I'm going to go over a really quick spiel that I always go over at the end of my lives. I've talked to you about how we're biologically nurturing and communal. This is who we are innately. So we live in a society that teaches us that's wrong. And when you live in a society that teaches you healthy things are unhealthy, your healthy reaction is depression and anxiety. So if you're dealing with a lot of depression and anxiety right now, you're having a healthy reaction to a sick society. And I want you to give yourself grace and love today. I want you to understand that you deserve that grace and love, because everybody breathing deserves love, and everybody breathing is worthy of life. We're all worthy to be here. We're all needed. We are all necessary. And if you have depression and issues about, there were not Black Indigenous people in Turtle Island before Columbus arrived, but we're not going to deal with your erasure right now. If you have issues with feeling depression and anxiety, this is a healthy response to an unhealthy society. And I need you to understand that that means that you're more awake. That means that you're more necessary to affect change. So if this is what you're dealing with, what you're feeling, I want you today to understand that you are worthy and that you are loved and that you are necessary. Give yourself grace. Give yourself love because you deserve it, and give yourself understanding. I'll be back probably tomorrow. Much loved, everybody. Take care of yourself today. Have a great one, everybody. Bye.
We have this immigration problem, and I don't mean the one that Donald